ink dried on the final page. My brother reached out and took the folder. He locked it in a steel safe. The guards moved to the doors. I was no longer a sister. I was an asset. I am Janet. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heart-warming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard, and drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. My brother's voice arrived over the phone like a cold draft, 20 years too late. It was a voice refined by boardrooms and private jets, stripped of the neighborhood accent we once shared. He didn't offer a reunion, he offered a transaction. He flew me to his estate, a fortress of glass and steel perched on a cliffside, where the air tasted of salt and expensive filtration. There were no family photos on the walls. There were only cameras with red eyes that followed my every movement. Arthur didn't stand to greet me. He remained seated behind a slab of black marble, sliding a leather-bound folder toward me with the tip of a gold pen. The contract was titled Domestic Services, but the terms read like a surrender. Live-in requirements, total silence, absolute compliance to his schedule. He watched me with the detached curiosity of a man observing an insect, his ring tapping a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat against the stone. I read the words, feeling the weight of the termination clauses that appeared on every page. Then I saw it. Buried in the fine print of Section 12 was the trap. A private arbitration clause that stripped me of every legal right. No courts, no police, no outside world. If I stepped out of line, I wouldn't just be fired, I would be handled. He called it security. I called it a cage. I looked into his eyes and saw a stranger who had forgotten the girl who once fed him when our mother couldn't. I picked up the pen. I signed the document not out of desperation, but because I had already seen the one thing he tried to hide, a flickering light in the forbidden East Wing that told me my brother's empire was built on a foundation of screams. The uniform felt like a shroud, heavy and stiff against my skin, marking me as a ghost in my brother's halls. Arthur didn't look at me as I moved through the foyer. I had already become part of the furniture, a silent witness paid for her discretion. My first task was the library, a room filled with books no one read, an air that felt thick with held breath. As I polished the mahogany shelves, I tracked the movements of the security team men with earpieces and empty eyes, who moved with a military precision that felt unnecessary for a private home. I noticed the keypad on the door to the East Wing, the one Arthur told me was off limits, the one that required a biometric scan he thought I hadn't noticed. But as I leaned down to clean the baseboards, I found a small, silver earring wedged into the floor vent, a piece of jewelry too cheap for a billionaire's house, stained with something dark and copper-scented. My heart hammered a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs as I realized the domestic services I was hired for weren't about cleaning dust, but about covering tracks. I looked up and saw a camera lens tilt downward, focusing directly on my hands. I tucked the earring into my palm, my face a mask of calm, knowing that in this house, the walls didn't just have ears, they had appetites. I wondered how many women had worn this uniform before me, and why none of them were here to hand it over. The shadow of a guard crossed the doorway, pausing just long enough for me to feel the cold edge of the contract's secret clause tightening around my throat. Dinner was served in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The clinking of Arthur's silver fork against fine china, sounding like a hammer on an anvil. I stood in the shadows of the dining hall, my hands folded, watching the man who shared my blood treat the world like his personal chessboard. He didn't speak to me, yet his presence filled the room with a suffocating arrogance, the kind that comes from knowing you can buy a person's silence as easily as a bottle of wine. After he retreated to his study, the house shifted, the night air bringing out the groans of the architecture and the faint, rhythmic hum of the high-voltage fences surrounding the perimeter. I waited until the clock struck 2, the hour when the guards rotated, and the monitors flickered for a split second during the system reset. I moved toward the east wing, my footsteps swallowed by the plush carpets, my breath shallow and cold in my chest. I reached the keypad, my mind racing back to the afternoon when I had watched Arthur's reflection in a silver tray as he punched in his code. A sequence of numbers that felt more like a death sentence than a password. The light turned from red to a ghostly green, and the heavy door hissed open with a sound like a dying gasp. The air on the other side was different, sterile, metallic, and smelling faintly of industrial bleach, and something sickly sweet that made my stomach turn. I stepped into a hallway lined with reinforced doors, each one fitted with a small, thick observation window. I peered into the first one, expecting to see a vault or a server room, but instead, I saw a living space that looked like a high-end prison cell, complete with bolted furniture and a single, unblinking camera in the corner. On the small table lay a child's drawing, a crude sketch of a family under a sun that had been scribbled out with black ink. I realized then that my brother wasn't just hiding money or secrets. He was running a private shadow world, a collection of lives held in the balance of his secret claws. A floorboard creaked behind me, and the sudden warmth of a person's breath hit the back of my neck. I didn't turn around, because I already felt the cold barrel of a weapon pressing into the base of my skull. The cold metal of the barrel was a silent command, a reminder that in this house, my life was worth less than the marble beneath my feet. I didn't breathe. I didn't tremble. I simply closed my eyes and waited for the darkness to claim me. But the voice that broke the silence was not Arthur's. It was a frantic, ragged whisper from a man I had never seen before. He was one of the guards, his face pale and eyes darting toward the cameras as he lowered the weapon, his hand shaking so violently I thought the gun might go off by accident. He didn't arrest me. He didn't scream. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and fear, and told me that if I wanted to live, I had to leave the hallway before the system finished its reboot. He whispered that he had seen what happened to the woman who occupied my uniform before me, and that the secret clause wasn't just a legal threat. It was a death warrant signed in advance. I retreated into the shadows of the main house, just as the red lights of the security cameras flickered back to life, their mechanical eyes sweeping the corridor with a predatory hunger. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of my narrow bed, staring at the silver earring I had hidden in my palm, realizing that the child's drawing I saw in that cell wasn't just a random sketch. It was a map of our childhood home, drawn with a detail only a family member could know. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, a cold truth that made the luxury of the estate feel like a gilded tomb. Arthur wasn't just holding strangers. He was holding a piece of our past that I thought had been buried in the ground decades ago. I looked toward the window as the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, and I saw a black sedan idling at the gate with no lights on, waiting for a passenger that was never supposed to leave. I understood then that I wasn't hired to clean his floors. I was hired to be the final witness to a crime so monstrous it required a sister's betrayal to keep it hidden. As the door to my room clicked open from the outside, I realized I was no longer watching the monster. The monster had decided it was time to show me exactly what lay beneath the basement floor. Arthur stood in the doorway, his silhouette cutting a sharp, jagged hole into the morning light. He didn't enter. He simply leaned against the frame, holding a steaming cup of tea, as if we were back in our childhood kitchen, and not in a fortress built on secrets. His voice was terrifyingly calm as he remarked on how early I had started my chores, his eyes drifting to the slight bulge in my pocket where the silver earring lay hidden. He spoke about family loyalty, about how the world is divided into those who own the ink and those who are written into the contracts, his tone shifting from brotherly to predatory in a single heartbeat. He invited me to join him for a walk in the gardens, a sprawling labyrinth of manicured hedges and stone statues that looked like frozen mourners. As we walked, the silence of the estate felt heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. He pointed to a patch of freshly turned earth near the perimeter wall, mentioning casually that some things are better left under the soil. And for a moment, I saw the mask slip. The billionaire vanished, leaving behind the cruel, desperate boy who used to drown stray cats in the creek behind our old house. He stopped walking and turned to face me, his hand gripping my elbow with a strength that bruised, and told me that he knew I had entered the East Wing. He didn't yell. He leaned in and whispered that the secret clause had a specific addendum for family members, one that involved a permanent residence in the very rooms I had peeked into. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I kept my face as cold as the marble in his foyer, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a tremor. I realized then that Arthur wasn't afraid of the law or the police. He was afraid of me, because I was the only person alive who knew the one secret that his billions couldn't bury. As we turned back toward the house, I noticed a second black sedan pull up behind the first, and a group of men in medical scrubs stepped out, carrying a folded stretcher that looked far too much like a body bag. Arthur smiled at me, a thin, lifeless expression, and told me that my medical evaluation was scheduled for noon. I looked at the high concrete walls topped with razor wire and realized that my time as a maid had ended and my time as a prisoner was about to begin. Men in the white scrubs moved with a robotic efficiency, their faces hidden behind surgical masks that turned them into faceless extensions of my brother's will. They didn't speak as they flanked me, their gloved hands resting on the handles of the stretcher, waiting for the signal to erase my existence. Arthur watched the scene with a detached coldness, sipping his tea as if he were observing a minor renovation rather than the abduction of his own sister. He told me that for someone of my age, the mind can often play tricks, and that a period of rest and observation in the private wing was for my own protection. I felt the first surge of true terror then, not the sharp fear of a blow, but the suffocating dread of being told I was insane by the very man who was driving me to the edge. As they moved to grab my arms, I reached into my pocket and gripped the silver earring, the sharp post digging into my thumb until I felt the warm sting of blood. I didn't fight them. I knew that any physical resistance would only justify the sedative I saw shimmering in the needle the lead medic held. I allowed them to lead me back toward the East Wing, my eyes scanning the courtyard for any sign of the guard who had warned me. But he was gone, replaced by a man with a scarred throat and a gaze that never left my throat. He passed through the biometric door, the hiss of the seal closing behind us, sounding like the lid of a coffin being hammered shut. The hallway was longer than I remembered, the fluorescent lights flickering with a hum that vibrated in my teeth. They led me past the cell with the child's drawing, for a split second, I saw a pale hand pressed against the glass of the next door, a hand with a small, distinctive birthmark on the wrist that made my world stop turning. It was the same birthmark our mother had, the one Arthur claimed had been buried with her in a closed casket 20 years ago. The realization that my brother hadn't just built a prison, but a laboratory for his own sick version of a family reunion, turned my blood to ice. As they pushed me onto the cold, vinyl surface of the exam table, the lead medic leaned over me, his eyes devoid of any human flicker. He didn't ask for my consent. He simply reached for the strap on my wrist and whispered that the secret clause also covered the donation of biological materials. Just as the needle touched my skin, the entire building groaned, and the lights plunged into a darkness so absolute I could hear my own heart screaming. The darkness was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smelled of ozone and panicked sweat. In the sudden silence of the power failure, the medical team froze, their mechanical precision shattered by the loss of sight. I didn't wait for the backup generators to kick in. I rolled off the exam table, the strap on my left wrist snapping with a jagged plastic sound that echoed against the tiled walls. I crawled across the floor, my fingers grazing the cold metal of the equipment carts, until I found the heavy, stainless steel tray I had spotted earlier. My brother's voice boomed over the intercom, distorted and frantic. No longer the calm billionaire, but a man who realized his control was leaking away through the floorboards. He was screaming for the lockdown protocol, for the doors to be sealed manually, but the chaos of the pitch-black hallway was my only ally. I moved toward the door where I had seen the hand with the birthmark, my heart thundering so loudly I feared it would give me away. I reached the glass and felt the vibration of someone sobbing on the other side, a broken, rhythmic sound that tore through my soul. Using the steel tray, I smashed the observation window, the glass shattering into 1,000 diamonds that sliced into my palms. I didn't care about the pain. I reached through the jagged hole and felt a hand grab mine, a hand that was thin, trembling, and far too cold. A voice, thin as a ghost's, whispered a name I hadn't heard in 2 decades, a name only my mother called me when the world was safe. Before I could pull her out, the red emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the hallway in a bloody, rhythmic pulse. I looked through the broken glass and saw her not a memory, but a living, breathing woman who had been aged by shadows instead of time. She wasn't dead. She was a harvest. Behind me, the heavy boots of the security team thudded against the floor, their flashlights cutting through the red gloom like searchlights. I realized then that Arthur's wealth wasn't built on tech or stocks. It was built on the illegal trade of the one thing you can't buy: time and life. As the guards rounded the corner, their weapons leveled at my chest, I saw my brother standing behind them, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated evil. He didn't tell them to stop. He pointed a finger at me and told them that the secret clause had just been upgraded to a permanent disposal order. But as his hand went to his radio to confirm the kill, the silver earring I had shoved into the door's manual override sparkled, and the entire east wing began to hiss with the sound of escaping gas. The hiss of the gas was a low, predatory whistle that filled the corridor, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Arthur's eyes widened, the realization hitting him that the safe environment he had engineered was now a pressurized bomb. The guards hesitated, their training failing them as the red emergency lights pulsed like a failing heartbeat against the fog. I grabbed my mother's hand through the shattered glass, pulling her weight toward the breach, her skin feeling like wet parchment under my touch. She was weak, her eyes unfocused. A woman who had been kept in the dark for so long but the dim red light seemed to blind her. Behind us, Arthur was screaming at his men to hold their positions, but the smell of chemicals grew sharper, a biting, acidic scent that made my lungs burn with every shallow breath. I knew the layout of the ventilation from my days spent scrubbing the intake grates. I knew there was a service crawl space just behind the medical supply cabinet, a dark vein that led straight to the foundations of the estate. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I hauled my mother through the jagged frame of the cell door, ignoring the way the glass tore at my uniform and her nightgown. We scrambled toward the cabinet just as the first guard fired a shot, the bullet whizzing past my ear and shattering a pressurized canister of oxygen behind us. The resulting explosion didn't bring the ceiling down, but it sent a wave of heat and white smoke through the hall, providing the perfect veil for our disappearance. We tumbled into the narrow, grease-slicked crawl space, the metal walls vibrating with the sound of Arthur's boots as he ran toward the cell, his voice high and thin, shrieking that we couldn't leave because we were his property. We crawled through the filth and the dark, the sound of the estate's massive cooling fans growing into a deafening roar ahead of us. My mother gripped my ankle, her fingers digging in with a desperate, silent plea. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt the fire of a daughter's rage replace the coldness of a sister's grief. We reached a heavy iron grate that looked out over the cliffside, the salt air of the ocean rushing in to meet us. But as I kicked at the rusted metal, I felt a hand grab my hair from behind. I was pulled backward into the darkness, and as I looked up, I saw the guard with the scarred throat hovering over me, a combat knife glinting in the red light of his tactical goggles. He didn't want to capture me anymore. He leaned in and whispered that Arthur had doubled the bounty if I didn't make it to the bottom of the cliff alive. The blade was a sliver of ice against my throat, its edge humming with the vibration of the guard's adrenaline. My mother let out a broken, choked sound as she watched from the edge of the grate, her eyes wide with a terror that had been 20 years in the making. The man with the scarred throat didn't hesitate. He leaned his full weight into the knife, his breath hot and smelling of tobacco against my cheek. But he had forgotten one thing. He was a mercenary fighting for a paycheck, and I was a woman fighting for the soul of my family. I reached into the waistband of my uniform and pulled out the heavy, industrial-grade glass shard I had palmed from the cell window, driving it upward into the soft tissue of his shoulder with every ounce of my remaining strength. He roared, the sound echoing through the metal crawl space like a wounded animal, and for a split second, the pressure on my throat vanished. I didn't wait for him to recover. I kicked him squarely in the chest, sending him sliding backward into the darkness of the vent, just as a secondary explosion rocked the east wing above us. The estate was tearing itself apart, the very systems Arthur used to enslave us now becoming the instruments of his ruin. I grabbed my mother and shoved her through the opening of the grate, the two of us tumbling onto a narrow, rain-slicked ledge that overlooked the churning black maw of the Atlantic Ocean. Wind screamed around us, a wild, liberating force that tasted of salt and freedom, but the drop was hundreds of feet of jagged rock and certain death. Behind us, the grate was kicked open, and Arthur himself crawled through the opening, his custom-tailored suit shredded, his face a contorted mask of desperation and fury. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at our mother, his eyes darting to the biometric bracelet still locked around her wrist, the key to his entire offshore empire. He stepped onto the ledge, his hands outstretched, not in a plea for forgiveness, but in a demand for his property. He told me that if I jumped, I would be forgotten, but if I handed her over, he would let me live in luxury for the rest of my days. I looked at the man who had turned our mother into a clinical specimen and realized that the secret clause had one final, unwritten rule. Blood is thicker than water, but it's also much easier to spill. As he lunged forward to grab her, the ledge beneath his feet gave a sickening, grinding groan, and I realized the cliffside wasn't as solid as his bank accounts. The stone beneath Arthur's feet didn't just crack, it vanished, swallowed by the hungry darkness of the Atlantic below. He lunged for my mother's throat, his fingers clawing at the biometric bracelet as if that piece of plastic could save his soul. But I was faster. I stepped between them, my boots anchoring into the only solid piece of granite left on the ledge, and I shoved him back with a force that had been simmering in my veins for 2 decades. He didn't scream like a hero. He made a thin, pathetic sound as his balance shifted over the void, his arms windmilling against the salt-heavy air. For a heartbeat, our eyes locked, and I saw the little boy who used to hide behind my skirt when the thunder rolled. But that boy was long dead, replaced by a monster who harvested his own kin for profit. He caught the edge of the ledge with one hand, his fingernails scraping against the wet stone, his face twisting into a desperate, weeping plea for mercy. He called my name, the words sounding like a curse in the wind, promising me half of everything, promising me a life of gold and silk if I just reached out and pulled him up. I looked down at his hand, then at my mother, who was shivering in the rain, her eyes finally clearing as she recognized the monster she had given birth to. I didn't reach for him. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver earring, the one stained with the copper scent of his previous victims. I dropped it onto the stone inches from his white-knuckled grip, a silent reminder of the women who didn't have a sister to save them. Ground gave one final, violent shudder as the internal fires of the east wing reached the gas lines, and the vibration was enough to break his hold. Arthur fell silently, a dark shape disappearing into the white foam of the crashing waves, leaving nothing behind but the smell of smoke and the sound of the ocean. I didn't look down to see him hit the water. I turned to my mother and began the long, agonizing crawl back up the cliff toward the burning estate. We weren't safe yet. The guards were still hunting. The fire was spreading, and I knew that Arthur's secret clause had a fail-safe trigger that would bring the entire mountain down if his heart stopped beating. As a low, rhythmic thumping sound began to vibrate through the earth beneath us, I realized the house wasn't just burning. It was preparing to erase every piece of evidence, including the two of us. The vibration wasn't just in the ground, it was in my bones, a deep, mechanical growl that signaled the house's final act of malice. Arthur had designed this place to be a tomb for his secrets, and now that his pulse had vanished into the Atlantic, the estate was beginning its self-destruct sequence. I hauled my mother onto the upper terrace, the heat from the east wing melting the soles of my shoes, the air thick with the toxic stench of burning plastics and old lies. The emergency sirens had shifted from a rhythmic pulse to a flat, high-pitched scream that tore at my eardrums, drowned out only by the sound of the glass walls, shattering one by one under the intense pressure of the heat. We reached the main courtyard, a space that had once looked like a palace, but now resembled a war zone, illuminated by the orange glow of the inferno. I saw the black sedans from earlier, their engines idling, the drivers long gone, but one vehicle remained, a heavy, armored SUV parked near the gate, its headlights cutting through the smoke like the eyes of a predator. As we stumbled toward it, a figure stepped out from behind the reinforced glass, holding a remote detonator that glowed with a sickly blue light. It was the head of security, the man who had overseen my hiring, and he wasn't looking for survivors. He was looking to finish the job Arthur had started. He told me that the secret clause included a massive insurance payout for the total loss of the property and its inhabitants, a payout he intended to collect alone. He raised the remote, his thumb hovering over the final trigger, and for a moment, the world went completely still, the only sound being the crackle of the flames and my mother's ragged breathing. I realized then that Arthur's greed didn't die with him. It had infected every person he touched, turning this house into a breeding ground for vultures. Just as his thumb pressed down, a shadow moved in the guard tower above, and a heavy iron beam, weakened by the heat, gave way with a thunderous crack. Man looked up, his face reflecting the falling metal, and I knew this was our only second to move before the entire courtyard became a crater. The iron beam descended like the blade of a guillotine, striking the armored SUV with a sound that shook the very foundations of the cliff. Head of security was swallowed by the wreckage, his greedy thumb never getting the chance to complete the circuit. I didn't look back at the carnage. I grabbed my mother's arm and shoved her toward the only opening left, a narrow service tunnel used for the estate's massive generators. The air inside was thick with the smell of diesel, and the deafening roar of machinery pushed to its breaking point. We ran through the dark, our hands scraping against the freezing concrete walls, guided only by the sparks showering from the overhead cables. My mother's strength was fading, her footsteps becoming heavy and staggered, but she gripped my hand with a ferocity that told me she wasn't ready to let the darkness win. We reached the end of the tunnel, a heavy steel hatch that led to the private pier where Arthur kept his speedboats, but the door wouldn't budge. It was electronically locked, held shut by the very system that was currently melting in the fire above us. I looked through the small, reinforced porthole and saw the water churning below, the white foam illuminated by the fire reflecting off the waves. Then I heard it, a rhythmic, metallic clanging coming from the other side of the hatch. Someone was trying to get in, or perhaps they were trying to make sure we stayed in. I picked up a heavy wrench from a nearby tool rack, my knuckles white, ready to face whatever monster Arthur had left behind to guard his exit. The hatch groaned, the seals hissing as the manual override was engaged from the outside. And as the heavy door swung open, I saw a face I never expected to see again. It was the guard with the scarred throat, the one I thought I had left for dead in the vents. But he wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a bleeding side, his face pale, and he pointed urgently toward the last remaining boat moored at the end of the pier. He whispered that the secret clause had a backup, a remote signal that had just been sent to a local private military contractor to sanitize the area. As the sound of approaching helicopters began to thrum in the distance, I realized our nightmare wasn't ending. It was simply moving from the land to the sea. The thrum of the helicopters grew from a distant hum into a chest-rattling roar, the searchlights cutting through the smoke like white daggers. We scrambled onto the deck of the sleek, black speedboat, the engine coughing to life with a predatory growl that vibrated through the soles of my feet. The guard with the scarred throat slumped against the pier, his duty, or perhaps his penance, finally complete, as he waved us into the darkness of the open sea. I pushed the throttle forward, and the boat surged into the waves, the salt spray stinging my eyes and washing away the soot of the burning estate. Behind us, the mansion finally gave way, a massive explosion of orange and white light erupting as the main gas lines reached critical mass, sending a shockwave across the water that nearly capsized us. I looked back and saw the silhouette of the cliffside crumbling, the billion-dollar fortress sliding into the Atlantic like a sinking ship, taking Arthur's secrets and his secret clause into the crushing depths. But the relief was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, I saw 3 sets of high-intensity LED lights hitting the water behind us, tactical interceptors, fast and lethal, closing the gap with terrifying speed. These weren't police, they were the sanitization team. The Shadow Army Arthur kept on retainer to ensure that no witness ever reached the shore. My mother huddled in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the burning horizon, her hand still clutching the biometric bracelet that was now a beacon for our hunters. I realized then that as long as she wore that device, we were a glowing target on a radar screen, a problem to be solved with a high-caliber round. I looked at the dark, freezing water, and then at the jagged coastline of a nearby uninhabited island, knowing that our only hope lay in the shadows where a boat couldn't follow. As the first spray of gunfire skipped across the waves beside us, I steered the boat toward the razor-sharp rocks of the shoreline, bracing for an impact that would either set us free or bury us in the surf. I reached over and gripped the pliers from the dash, looking my mother in the eye as I prepared to do the one thing that would finally cut the tether to my brother's ghost. The pliers bit into the heavy plastic of the biometric bracelet, the metal groaning as I squeezed with every ounce of my remaining strength. My mother didn't flinch, her gaze fixed on the pursuing interceptors that were now close enough for me to see the silhouettes of the men behind the mounted guns. With a final, sharp snap, the device broke, its red tracking light flickering once before dying completely. I didn't hesitate. I threw the dead plastic into the churning wake of our boat, watching as the interceptors immediately veered off toward the floating signal, their searchlights dancing over the empty waves. We weren't safe, but we were invisible. I cut the engine and let the momentum carry us into the jagged teeth of the island's cove, the hull of the boat screaming as it scraped against the submerged rocks. We hit the shore with a bone-jarring thud, the impact throwing us forward into the damp, cold sand of a beach that felt like the edge of the world. I dragged my mother from the wreckage, our shadows stretched long by the distant glow of the burning estate, and we crawled into the thick, thorny underbrush just as the first helicopter circled back, its thermal camera scanning the beach for the heat signatures of 2 women who were supposed to be dead. The silence of the island was terrifying, a thick, heavy quiet that felt like a predator holding its breath. We moved deeper into the forest, the branches clawing at my face, until we found a narrow limestone cave hidden behind a curtain of weeping moss. Inside, the air was still and smelled of ancient stone, a sanctuary that Arthur's satellites could never reach. As I sat there in the dark, holding my mother's shaking hands, she leaned in and whispered the first words she had spoken since I found her. She didn't talk about the prison or the pain. She told me that Arthur wasn't the one who came up with the secret clause. She told me that the contract had been drafted by someone else, someone who was still out there, someone who had been watching us from the very beginning. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine as she pulled a small, crumpled photograph from her tattered gown, a photo of our family from 40 years ago. But there was a third child in the background, a face I had never seen, standing in the shadows of our old house. I realized then that my brother wasn't the master of this game. He was just another pawn who had been discarded when his time was up. The image in the photograph seemed to pulse with a hidden malice, the unknown child's eyes appearing as 2 black voids in the faded paper. I looked at my mother, her face a map of exhaustion and ancient grief, and realized that our family tree had a branch I was never allowed to see. She whispered a name, Elias, a name that sounded like a secret whispered in a graveyard. He was the eldest, the one our parents had hidden away in a state sanitarium, because his mind was a labyrinth of cruelty that even they couldn't navigate. Arthur hadn't built the empire. He had inherited the blueprints from a brother who pulled the strings from the shadows of illegal anonymity. The secret clause wasn't a corporate tool. It was Elias' signature, a way to collect the family he felt had abandoned him, one by one, until he had us all under his thumb. As the realization settled in my gut like lead, a low, digital chime echoed through the cave, vibrating from the pocket of my uniform. I froze, my hand trembling as I reached in and pulled out a burner phone I didn't remember carrying. The screen was a bright, clinical white, and a single text message sat in the center of the display. It wasn't a threat or a demand. It was a GPS coordinate for a location only 3 miles from where we sat, and a timestamp that was counting down the seconds until dawn. Beneath the coordinates was a single sentence: "The maid's work is never done." My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand as I realized the guard, with the scarred throat, hadn't been helping me escape. He had been delivering me to the next stage of the contract. The helicopters hadn't left. They were hovering just beyond the tree line, waiting for the signal to move in. Once I reached the final destination, I looked at my mother, seeing the hollow reflection of a life stolen. And I knew that if I didn't go to those coordinates, they would burn this island to ash just to find us. I stood up, the cave floor feeling like it was tilting beneath me, and I realized that to end this, I wouldn't need a lawyer or a gun. I would need to face the architect of our misery in the place where the secret clause was born. As I stepped out into the moonlight, I saw a single black envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of our wrecked boat, and I knew that the true nightmare was only just beginning. The black envelope felt heavier than it should have, the paper thick and cold, as if it had been stored in a freezer. Inside was no letter, only a skeleton key made of heavy iron, and a lock of hair tied with a blue ribbon, my ribbon, from a birthday I had long since forgotten. I didn't show it to my mother. I tucked it away, masking my terror with a face of stone as I led her through the dense, suffocating canopy of the island. The coordinates led us to a structure that shouldn't have existed, a colonial-style house rising out of the tropical rot, a perfect, terrifying replica of our childhood home, right down to the chipped white paint on the porch. It sat there in the moonlight like a ghost, silent and expectant, a monument to a past that refused to stay buried. As we approached, the front door swung open without a sound, the warm glow of candlelight spilling onto the overgrown grass, smelling of lavender and floor wax. I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking in the exact same spot they did 40 years ago, and I felt the weight of the secret clause finally manifesting as a physical presence. Inside, the table was set for 4, the steam rising from plates of food that looked exactly like the Sunday dinners our mother used to make before the world fell apart. A man sat at the head of the table, his back to us, his suit perfectly tailored, his hands resting motionless on the lace tablecloth. He didn't turn around, but his voice, deep, melodic, and terrifyingly familiar, filled the room, thanking me for finally arriving to complete my duties. He spoke of the contract not as a legal binding, but as a family covenant, a way to ensure that we would never be separated by the inconveniences of the outside world again. I looked at the wall behind him and saw a row of monitors, each one showing a different room in the house we had just left, and one showing a live feed of the very cave where we had hidden. My mother let out a small, broken whimper as the man slowly began to turn his chair, and I realized that Arthur was never the monster. He was just the distraction. The man facing us had the same eyes as mine, but they were empty, 2 dead moons, reflecting a mind that had spent decades perfecting the art of the cage. Held up a second contract, this one written in an ink that looked suspiciously like dried blood, and told me that my signature was the only thing standing between my mother and a permanent retirement. As he slid the pen toward me, I noticed the shadow of someone else moving in the kitchen behind him, someone whose footsteps were silent, and I realized that this house was much more crowded than I thought. The shadow in the kitchen didn't move like a person, it drifted like a memory, a silent shape that made the hair on my neck stand up. Elias didn't look back. He kept his eyes fixed on me, his smile as sharp and sterile as a surgical blade. He pushed the second contract forward, the paper crinkling with a sound like dry autumn leaves, and told me that my signature was the final seal on our family's legacy. He explained that Arthur had been weak, a man who loved the money more than the control, but that I was different. I was the one who survived the floors, the one who saw the blood in the vents and kept moving. He wanted me to be his partner, the hand that would manage the human assets, while he stayed in the shadows, orchestrating the lives of those who thought they were free. My mother's hand gripped my shoulder, her fingernails digging into my skin, a silent plea for me to run, but there was nowhere left to go. I looked at the pen, a heavy instrument of gold and bone, and I realized that the secret clause wasn't about work at all. It was about the total ownership of the soul. I picked up the pen, feeling its cold weight, and I saw Elias' eyes flash with a triumphant hunger, the look of a man who had finally captured the last piece of his collection. But as I lowered the nib to the paper, the shadow in the kitchen stepped into the candlelight, and the face that emerged was one I had seen in the basement of the estate, the guard with the scarred throat, his face now twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't have a gun. He had a canister of the same industrial gas that had turned Arthur's wing into a tomb. He didn't look at me. He looked at Elias, and I realized that the guard wasn't working for my brother or for the mercenaries. He was the father of the girl whose silver earring I still carried in my pocket, a man who had spent 10 years infiltrating this nightmare to find the man at the top. He clicked the valve open, the hiss of the gas filling the room with a sound like 1,000 angry snakes, and Elias' smile finally vanished, replaced by a gray, panicked mask of mortality. Secret clause had ignored the one thing that money can't account for: the patience of a man who has already lost everything. As the first wisps of the chemical fog touched the candlelight, I knew the house was about to become a furnace, and the exit was already being blocked by the very men Elias had hired to protect him. The air in the room turned heavy and sweet, a cloying scent that signaled the beginning of the end. Elias lunged across the table, his manicured fingers clawing for the contract, as if the paper itself could grant him immunity from the poison filling the air. He wasn't a mastermind anymore. He was a drowning man in a suit, gasping for a breath that only brought more fire into his lungs. The guard with the scarred throat stood like a statue in the kitchen doorway, his eyes fixed on Elias with a hollow, satisfied stare, ignoring the gas that was already beginning to cloud his own vision. I grabbed my mother, pulling her toward the heavy oak door, but the locks clicked shut with a sharp, electronic finality. Elias had wired the house to be a vault, and now he was trapped in it with the ghosts of his victims. He stumbled toward us, his face turning a mottled purple, his voice a ragged wheeze as he begged me to use the iron key he had sent. I looked at the key in my hand, then at the monitors on the wall, which were now flickering with static as the house's systems began to melt. I realized that the secret clause had one final trap. The key would only work if the person using it stayed behind to hold the manual override. It was a choice between my life and my mother's freedom. A final, cruel joke from a brother who wanted to own me even in death. Through the thickening fog, I saw the guard collapse, his mission finally over, leaving the three of us in a silence broken only by the roar of the fire starting in the walls. I shoved the key into the lock and felt the mechanism groan, the heavy bolts sliding back just enough for a person to squeeze through. I pushed my mother toward the opening, her screams of protest drowned out by the thundering collapse of the roof in the next room. She disappeared into the night air, and for a second, I felt the cold wind of the ocean on my face. But as I turned to follow, a hand gripped my ankle with the strength of a dying demon. Ilias was on the floor, his eyes bulging, his teeth bared in a horrific grin as he pulled me back into the heart of the haze. He whispered that if he was going to hell, he was taking the maid with him to keep the place clean. Floorboards beneath us gave way, dropping us into the dark crawl space where the foundation met the cliff. And as the house above us exploded into a pillar of flame, I felt the ground dissolve into nothingness. The fall felt like an eternity, a chaotic descent through splintering wood and freezing air, until the icy shock of the Atlantic swallowed us whole. The water was a black, crushing weight that slammed the air from my lungs, the darkness beneath the waves, even more absolute than the smoke in the house. I struggled toward the surface, but Ilias' grip was a shackle. His fingers locked around my leg with a rigor mortis strength that refused to let go even as the ocean filled his throat. We tumbled together in the current, two shadows sinking into the abyss, until the jagged silhouette of a submerged rock loomed ahead. I kicked out with everything I had, the heel of my boot connecting with his temple, and finally, the pressure vanished. I watched his body drift away, a pale shape turning over and over as he was pulled into the deep, his billions and his secrets finally settling at the bottom of a grave he couldn't buy his way out of. I broke the surface gasping, the air tasting of salt and smoke, and saw the island engulfed in a tower of fire that lit the sky like a second sun. The replica house was gone, leaving only a blackened scar on the cliffside. I swam toward the shore, my muscles screaming and my vision blurring, until my hands touched the coarse sand of the beach where I had left my mother. She was there, a small, huddled figure silhouetted against the inferno, her eyes fixed on the water. When she saw me, she didn't speak. She simply held out her hand and pulled me from the surf, her touch the only warm thing left in a world of ice. We sat there on the sand, watching the remains of our family's legacy burn to ash, but the silence was interrupted by a low, rhythmic thrumming that wasn't the wind or the waves. Out on the horizon, a single white light was blinking, a code I recognized from the security monitors. It was a signal from a ship, a vessel that shouldn't have been there, broadcasting a message that the sanitization was incomplete. I reached into the pocket of my soaked uniform and felt a small, hard object I hadn't noticed before, a microchip that must have been hidden inside the silver earring all along. I realized then that the secret clause wasn't just a contract for us. It was a blueprint for something much larger, a network of power that spanned far beyond Arthur or Ilias. As the white light on the horizon grew larger, I knew that the hunt hadn't ended with the fire. It had only just expanded. The white light on the horizon wasn't a rescue. It was a hungry eye, searching for the loose threads of a story that was never meant to be told. I stood on the shore, the microchip biting into the meat of my palm, a tiny piece of silicon that held the names, the bank accounts, and the locations of every domestic service cell across the globe. My brothers were gone, one to the fire, one to the depths. And yet, the machine they served was already recalibrating to erase the glitch I had become. I looked at my mother, her face aged a century in a single night, and I saw the same realization in her eyes. We weren't survivors, we were evidence. I knew that if we stayed on this beach, we would be a footnote by sunrise, just another tragic accident at sea. I led her back to the wreckage of the speedboat, finding a small emergency canister of fuel that hadn't leaked. As the first light of dawn touched the water, gray and unforgiving, I poured the fuel over the debris and struck a match, creating one last diversion to mask our departure into the deeper shadows of the coastline. We didn't head for the mainland. We headed for the places where people don't ask for names, the corners of the world where a maid can disappear into the fabric of the working class. I spent the next weeks moving in the dark, my eyes always on the rearview mirror, my hand always near the chip that was my only shield and my greatest curse. The secret clause had promised a life of service, and in a way, it kept its word. I was no longer cleaning floors. I was cleaning up a legacy of blood, sending the information on that chip to every whistleblower brave enough to open an encrypted file. But even as the empires began to crumble, I knew the shadow was still watching. If you've made it this far into the darkness with me, it means you're now a witness to the truth they tried to bury. So if you want to see how deep this rabbit hole really goes, and make sure these stories never stay hidden, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Your support is the only thing that keeps the light on in a world full of secrets. Late one night, in a small apartment in a city that didn't know my face, I heard a familiar, rhythmic tapping on my door, the same code Arthur used to use when we were children. I didn't open it. I simply picked up my bag, looked at my mother sleeping peacefully for the first time in 20 years, and walked out the back fire escape. The contract was never about the money or the house. It was about the chase, and as I stepped into the rain, I realized I wasn't the one being hunted anymore. I was the one holding the broom, and the world was finally ready for a deep clean.